I want to welcome everyone to our second lecture in the School of Architecture lecture series. Super excited to have Chris Cornelius join us today. My name is Blaine Brownell. I'm the director of the School of Architecture, and I want to welcome students, faculty, staff, and friends and guests of the school. Before introducing Chris, I just want to briefly read a land acknowledgement. So this UNC Charlotte land acknowledgement was written by the Women's and Gender Studies program here. Today, this acknowledgement is being read from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on Catawba territory. Although we encourage you, wherever you are, because some of you may not be here in Charlotte, to remember and recognize the Native peoples on whose lands you are located today. The University of North Carolina, Charlotte is located on the traditional territories of the Catawba, Waxhaw, Cheraw, and Sugaree peoples. And as many of us are settlers, migrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this land, we are here because this land is colonized. The city of Charlotte itself is located on the traditional crossroads of two indigenous trading paths, the Occaneechi Path and the Lower Cherokee Traders Path, two routes that facilitated the extensive trade networks of Cherokee, Catawba, Saponi, and Congaree peoples prior to colonization. Many descendants of Cheraw, Waxhaw, and Sugaree communities eventually joined the Catawba peoples, and today the Catawba Nation continues to thrive as a federally recognized tribe located less than 1 hour south of our university. Thank you for being with us today. We hope you'll accept this invitation to honor, protect, and sustain this land and all of Turtle Island through shared knowledge and support of the Catawba, Cheraw, and many other indigenous communities who continue to thrive here today. With that, I'll start with the introduction for our speaker today. Chris Cornelius is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is the founding principal of Studio Indigenous, a design practice serving indigenous clients. Cornelius was a collaborating designer with Antoine Predock on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. He is a recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the inaugural Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbus, a 2018 Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award, and an artist residency from the National Museum of the American Indian. Chris's work has been exhibited widely, including the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. During next semester, spring 2021, he will be the Lewis Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor of Architectural Design at Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Chris Cornelius.
Thank you, and thank you, Blaine, for the invitation to speak. I unfortunately can't be in Charlotte, but I was there 3 years ago and had a great time and visiting the school, and was fortunate to have my work exhibited in a symposium that Mark Manick had put together. And so I've fond memories of Charlotte, so I'm happy to kind of be here again. Wat kuf nuela du Chris Nyongets Aquahoni Wagita Loda Okele Oneta Aga Nwagata Choda. So I said in my language that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So I want to share, not only just share the work with you, but to begin to think about or help frame the work and how I think about it, and what really kind of how I'm approaching the work, and particularly indigenous design. Like, what does that really mean to me, and how do we begin to think about it differently? I think oftentimes when we think of history, we tend to roll it back to, especially the history of America, roll it back to 1492 and don't realize that there are tens of thousands of years of people inhabiting this land before that. And that includes architecture. There was architecture here before that, right? And if we're going to talk about American architecture, we should be extending it back that far. So I will share a few things, a few thoughts about how I see the land, and then how does that inform the work. And so when I share an image like this is it's a national monument called Bears Ears, and you'll see at the bottom here the 4 languages, indigenous languages that the people that inhabit that land, that are indigenous to it, and what they call it, and they basically all translate into Bears Ears. If you look at the landscape, you can kind of see that it looks similar to a pair of ears of a bear that may be partially kind of submerged. And so I'm really both sort of culturally ingrained in this idea notion, but really compelled by this idea that the ways that indigenous people see the landscape usually gets associated with the name of the place and what it looks like, right? Like it's not just a kind of, we don't just leave it at the Bear's Ears or whatever it might be. There are tons and tons of examples of this, and I just used this one. But I think that there are gateways into understanding scientific things, geological things, natural things. They allow us to begin to explain those things. And so when we see things, especially when we see things as animals or other sorts of entities or specifics of place, I'm really interested in that. And I think that architecture certainly has the ability to do a similar thing in the landscape. One of the first projects, well, the project that I started my practice with in 2003, I was asked to be a cultural consultant and collaborating designer with Antoine Predock on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. It's a K4 through 8 private school just south of the city, and students only have to prove native ancestry to attend the school. There's about 340-ish students. And so while we were designing this school, it's for all of the tribes of Wisconsin. It's not just for a specific tribe. And so while those tribes have similarities and our cultures are similar in that we're all Eastern Woodland, there are some differences. So we decided to kind of focus on cultural values, and then we rendered visible these values. And we went through an entire list of a few hundred different kind of values. We pulled out about 30 of the most important ones. And so like this one is dance, and this one is the cycles of the moon. We were really interested in showing how these things overlapped. When we presented them to the clients, we presented them on huge, like 3-foot by 4-foot transparencies on a light box. We began to talk about how those things interacted with one another in a series of reciprocities. That the idea notion of how indigenous people see the land, how the culture is connected to building and habitation, all of the cultural rituals is really a series of reciprocities. It's not just a simple sort of cause and effect. And so when we started talking about the building, we really talked about it as an animal. And that's kind of the thing that I mean, I learned a lot about working with someone like Antoine Predock. He actually won the AIA gold medal while we were working on the project. It was like kind of like going to grad school again, but I really kind of learned a lot about how I wanted to practice, how I was going to practice for indigenous people. So during that process, he never called it a building. Like during the schematic design for almost a year and a half, we didn't really call it a building. It was a project, and we started to talk about the project as an animal. We began to examine the program. We wanted to think about what we were calling things was important, right? So we decided early on that we weren't going to use any of these institutional labels. We weren't ever going to call the place that they eat the cafeteria. They don't call it the cafeteria. They've never called it the cafeteria. We don't call the place where you come in the lobby. We call it community. The theater is drum. The stair that connects the elementary school grades to the middle school grades is called Earth to Sky, is like a rite of passage. And so we gave these places these kinds of titles. And so in that regard, we're trying to tap into this notion that how indigenous people see things is really important in what they call them, and then the languages that start to translate those. They teach 3 of the 5 languages that are in the state. They teach Oneida, Menominee, and Ojibwe. It's Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi that they don't teach, only because those communities don't want their languages taught in the school. They want to preserve it for themselves. But so students get to speak those languages, and so they begin to understand not only the larger landscape, but the place that they inhabit every day for school. It's about 160,000 square feet. It's almost a quarter mile from one end, from the gym to the other end. The school purchased about 200 acres, some of which is farmland and some of which is just basically untouched sort of forest, wetland sort of area. These students are mostly coming from urban areas in Milwaukee to this place. Many don't have connections to their home reservations. And so the idea of the building's connection to nature was really kind of important to us. One of the places that we gave a name to is the place that students enter and exit every day. We call it migration. We don't just call it the student entrance, we call it migration. So this idea that there's a daily ritual, students come in and out, it's a big sort of thing that happens in the school in the morning and then again in the afternoon. So we were really kind of trying to embed these kinds of stories, and I'm happy that the students have and even staff, teachers have taken on these stories in the project till today. The school opened in 2007. So it's been around. The school as an entity celebrated its 50th year just last year. Was started by 3 mothers who were unhappy with how Indigenous history was being taught in regular public schools. So they started their own school and eventually started this campus and built this building as an independent structure. The tree columns come from the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, just northwest of Green Bay. In their culture, the trees are really important. These are white pines, many of which are over 300 years old. And so we talked about them as they hold stories, these trees. They existed pre-European contact. And so we put them into the building. You'll see them in a couple of photos here. They kind of show up throughout the building. This is community, the main space that people come into. Any space in the school where people might come together or gather. There's a large fireplace because fire is a place of council that people gather around. Lower left here is the drum, the theater, where many activities and rituals happen. All school meetings, those kinds of things happen in that particular space. So I also want to share with you 3 kind of themes that I've been sort of developing, and the themes really emerged out of an exhibition, a solo exhibition I had at the University of Arkansas early last year. And I began to think about how do I begin to think about my own work in an exhibition, and how am I going to explain it to others? So the first is design as ceremony. To me, if I think of design as a ceremony, not as an activity, I begin to think about the things that are rituals within that ceremony, right? Like if we begin to think about how we are designing things and putting things into the world, then we start to think about it more as something more than just a discipline, an activity, that sort of thing. That's really kind of how I start to think about it. So during my sort of practice, there was a time when things were slow commission-wise, and I started to speculate through building models, and I started to think about, what if I didn't have a client, a site, a program? And what if I started to think about things that may be built by something else? Meaning, what if they're not made by humans? What if they're made by animals? What if they're made by something almost supernatural? But the things that are making them have this kind of tacit understanding of nature. So that's the sort of overarching theme. Then the other sort of thing, like where I take this kind of ceremonial aspect, I guess. I'm still a designer. I like to make things, and I'm interested in materials. And so I was interested in making scale models using brass, bronze, copper, soldering, patinating these metals in different ways, and then casting these plaster landscapes. How was I going to like begin to cast these things? I was really, and still am, really intrigued with the idea that the things that you put into the world as a designer aren't always like formulated in your mind and then you build them, right? Like it's not just like I think of the thing and then I draw the thing, or I think of the thing and I make a scalar representation of the thing. What if I just let the thing come out? And so in some ways, these are 3-dimensional sketches, meaning I don't know exactly what it is. There's no plan at the beginning of it. I start putting materials together. Sometimes they do have drawings, but sometimes they don't. I started collecting these found boxes, and I thought of that as the site. So sometimes when we get a site, we can't change it, right? We can't make it bigger. We can't make it smaller. It has conditions I have to deal with, those kinds of things. So this is an old sewing machine base that I cast this plaster within. And then I started to, I decided that I wasn't going to use people as the scale figures. I was only going to use animals, right? So that was part of it as well. These were really, so I did this for an exhibition. I probably built around 10 to 12 in this really sort of short period of time. And that allowed me to really kind of work through these ideas rather quickly. So these are two versions that kind of started in my sketchbook as drawings. I was interested in, well, how can I make a cladding that's like an eagle's feathers? What if I made a place where you would just sit and look at the moon in this card file box kind of site? The one on the left became a thing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But these were my sort of opportunities. I think of them as almost like athletic conditioning, right? Like I run a series of drills before I run the race. If I'm waiting for a client to commission me for a project, I'm not always going to be able to do that. So thinking about larger commissions as that kind of race. In 2018, I won the Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award for Best Temporary Installation. And this was an artist residency that I did that's in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee here. The children's literature garden. And so what I did in my proposal is I wrote about how important the role of a trickster is in storytelling. In indigenous storytelling, a trickster is usually, sometimes it's an animal, like a coyote or rabbit or something else, but it's there to teach us lessons about ourselves, right? It's there to tell us lessons about greed and vanity and other sorts of things. So there, there's stories of when the rabbit ate too much, or a rabbit wanted to be a wolf and he tried to trick there's one story where a rabbit tried to trick a girl into liking him, and he tried to convince her that the wolves liked him, and then he suffered the consequences of that. But to me, the interesting thing is, like, in those stories, the animals never lose their animalness, right? They're still somewhat human. So I was interested in making an architectural thing that I wasn't compelled by program or site or what it was. I harvested trees on the site. I was interested in using the copper mesh that I had been making these models. So I was really interested in translating the models into full scale. What would happen if I began to do that, where I didn't produce these drawings or I didn't produce a model of the thing. I just kind of picked a place on the garden to do that. And what it did was afforded children coming to the garden to kind of make up their own stories about why it's there, where it came from. That was really the intention. This particular piece is sort of loosely based on this model. I used the exact same copper mesh. I did the exact same things to it to patinate it. And you'll notice these things at the top. I call it its regalia. And so thinking about indigenous dress as regalia, and sometimes those things are trophies or signifiers of where you came from, what clan you belong to, battles you've seen, awards you've won, or all of those things together. So it's like a hyper ornament. It's a cultural thing. It's not just a part of an adornment. And I began to think, well, what if architecture could have regalia, right? Like, what if the architecture could begin to do that? So in this case, the trickster became a thing that I added these sort of embellishments to throughout its kind of life. And the structure itself, I basically erected myself using a technology. It's basically like a teepee where 3 trees are loosely tied together and you can pull it up and then I can kind of move it around. The image on the right is what I call it sketch phase. I'm just pulling limbs together. There's no big plan for how they go together, other than I'm just trying to triangulate them to kind of make it structurally stable. And I'm also trying to make smaller spaces for the copper mesh to kind of span on it. Hear the audio. Spirit of Space they're friends of mine, and they make films for Jeannie Gang and Stephen Hall. And one day they sent me an email saying, well, we want to go film a Trickster because there's snow out. And I said, great. So they went out there, and I didn't tell them really much about it, but the film that they made, I really like, because it begins to show me things about the thing. I like how they filmed it like it's almost like an animal that they were going to scare if they got too close to it. So they began to kind of tell their own kind of Trickster story, and I like that it's a short sort of 1 minute thing. It's almost like a trailer for the film to come. But I was really kind of happy that they did that. I built a second Trickster. This one was for the Knoll Fellowship. I won the Knoll Fellowship for established artists here in Milwaukee. They picked 2 established artists and 3 emerging artists to give this fellowship to, and then part of it is a group exhibition at the Haggerty Museum at Marquette University. And so it was my opportunity to make a Trickster inside now in this gallery space. And so part of it for me, the Trickster is it's a character that I can speak through, and it kind of speaks back to me. Meaning, in this case, I was interested in this idea: what if the Trickster was really like proud about this fellowship and this exhibition, and it got the biggest space in the gallery? How am I going to change the way that it begins to think, and it positions itself in this exhibition? You can see the other artists' work in the group exhibition, but using the same again materials, trees that are harvested at Linden Sculpture Garden near Milwaukee here, and then the copper mesh. This time I started to play a little bit more with the regalia. You can see these antlers. We don't know if this is a Trickster's, like, are they trophies? Is it just showing off? And then I made this kind of sight drawing out of tape on the floor to kind of position the piece within the gallery. So the trees that the thing is made out of are they're like 26 to 28 feet long. And again, this one is loosely based on the one on this model on the right. This model on the right, like when I wrapped the wire around it, one of it was this idea of just kind of creating a sort of action at the top of it. The other sort of practical thing was like, how was I going to cover up all this joinery of the top of the thing? And so I wanted to translate that into full scale in this particular piece. And so I started to do that. The sort of idea of the thing being a kind of tripod, and the cladding being like almost like clothing was also things that I was trying to do with it. When I'm making these things, it's hard for me to explain, but I'll try to explain. It starts to speak to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. So as a designer, I like that idea that as architects, we're trying to like make things happen in a way that we're trying to explain to other people to do contractually. How can we begin to think about what we make, what we draw, what we build differently? And so when I was doing this, like putting this copper mesh on it, there isn't a big plan to do that other than just putting it on, trying to hide the seam. So I felt like I was making a shirt for a giant bear. This idea that I had to fold and seam it, I'm just using a pneumatic stapler to attach it. This was really kind of intriguing to me, because the thing itself started to speak to me in a lot of ways. Even when I erected these trees, it sat in a position that it determined what it was. I put this tag on there, you're on indigenous land, to kind of remind people that you are on indigenous land. Even institutions of higher learning and art museums are on indigenous land. And so the Trickster kind of wants to remind you of that fact. Another aspect of the work that I kind of want to share is this idea that we think of this as the origins of architecture, right? At least that's what I think one of the shortcomings of our architectural educations is to say that this is it, Loget's primitive hut. But when we look at this image, we're looking at the architect here pointing at nature, basically saying, look what I did. This is what it is. I oppose that with what indigenous architecture actually is, right? It integrated into nature in a very different way, that it's not just, nature isn't just a set of resources for us to use, to dominate, and to build with. So the fundamental differences between these two images for me is that this notion that nature is mine to kind of master and build and inhabits. And the difference here is that nature is me. I'm related to the architecture. The architecture is related to the world, it's related to the trees. Every living thing is related to each other. And I believe that if we thought about buildings as if we were related to them, like they're my cousins, I would begin to think about them differently, right? I would think about every single material I put into the building. I would think about the people that made the building, the people that made the materials. What are their families like? If I have that kind of responsibility, that's where I begin to think about everyone that might use the thing. What are the sort of political, socio-economic implications of what I'm doing? That's really kind of what I'm advocating for. This idea that you would begin to think about that. And for me, that's kind of where, or at least one of the parts of the heart of Indigenous architecture, where that actually lies in the spectrum of architecture. I don't reject the things that I've learned in architecture school. I just know that there's more. There's more to it than what is being taught and what we always taught, right? The books that we use for history aren't the only books for understanding architectural history. That's where I think we need to be talking about, right? We do need to learn about Corb. We shouldn't reject that, but we should be learning about what Indigenous people were doing in these landscapes. And that's not just the US, it's all over the world. What were the people that are Indigenous to those lands doing? And so that's really kind of compels me. In 2016, I was asked to be, I was a finalist for the Miller Prize. There were 10 of us that were selected, and we were competing for 5 prizes. There was 5 sites that we would build these installations on. I happened to win the site that I was given. The site that I was given was the First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen. Designed it with his son Eero Saarinen in the early 40s. It's like the first sort of modern piece in Columbus, Indiana. I won't get into the whole history of Columbus, Indiana, but really an amazing place. It's a heart of modernism in the Midwest, in the US. It's really quite an amazing place. But I was given this site to place an installation on. What I wanted to do was to call attention to the people that were Indigenous to that area. That is a history that was erased very quickly in Indiana. And it happens to be the Miami or Miami, and they built wigwams like many Great Lakes sort of cultures. And those things were basically dome structures that were made out of tree saplings and clad in either reed mats or bark mats in this kind of shingled-like manner. So I began to look at these different wigwams, and I started to think about how these things are sort of technologically advanced, meaning like how the poles are put into the ground, the fact that you have to have a fire in it. So there has to be 2 sources of air to let the smoke out, and then how do you deal with the weather? Like all of those kinds of things were things that I was interested in. I was also interested in this idea that when we look at native artifacts, they're usually not just, they don't just mean one thing, meaning like this image on the right is the Miami ribbon cutting. It's a thing that they do. But the pattern itself is really an interesting sort of moire pattern of multiple grids that are put over one another. But they're meant to, they usually reflect things in nature. It might be fish scales or bird feathers. This idea notion when we look at the bird, its tail feathers are very different than its head feathers, right? Like the head has to move around to see its prey. The tail and wings have to be able to maneuver itself very quickly. Those kinds of things. And so I started to think of the cladding of this piece as being its feathers. It's put on the site of the church. It's actually the northwest part of the site. I don't know what the answer to this question is, but it's the one time I've ever seen Eliel Saarinen always drew this church with north down, right? Well, this is a convention that we're not told not to do, but for some reason he put north down, and I don't know what the answer to that was. But he did use a golden section throughout this entire project, and that was one of the things that I used to help kind of cite the project in making the piece.
Wikiami is sited on First Christian Church, National Historic Landmark, designed by Eero Saarinen and Eliel Saarinen, his father. It's really a significant piece here in Columbus, and so I'm very happy to have Wikiami on the site at First Christian Church. Wikiami is the Miamia word for wigwam, which was a traditional dwelling of the Miami people. So I wanted to address the indigenous people of Indiana, particularly this area, and I wanted to make a structure that addressed how Native people see the world, see nature, see building. So what I tried to do was to look at the original wigwam structure. What are the constituent parts of that? Why did they use those pieces? So it was originally a round sort of structure that they used wood saplings that they put into the ground and then bent over to create a dome sort of shape and then clad it with mats or bark. So what I tried to do is to look at how those original structures were made and then to do that in a contemporary way using modern materials. The structure is steel rebar that is welded together, and then the outside is an expanded steel skin to allow some transparency. So sometimes it looks very veil-like. You can see right through it, and then different parts of the day when light is on it, it looks a little bit more opaque. Saarinen's writing, and he talks about nature and how architecture can be sympathetic to nature. The trees here make a very dense canopy. With the exception of this one corner, there's a kind of cavity within that canopy, and so that's kind of why the piece actually leans forward a bit. It kind of leans over the walk and to tuck it into the trees and to not really disturb any of the site. We built a wood form on scaffolding that was CNC cut, and then we had a company in Indianapolis bend the rebar in the elliptical shapes for the horizontals, and those were welded together. And I had a great crew of guys from Forcia, which is a local company here, that volunteered their time. They're excellent craftsmen, excellent workers, so they helped develop a system for putting these rings on, welding the verticals together, and to help put the panels on. So, you know, people made this, even though the panels are water jet cut and we parametrically figured them out. Human hands made this thing. That to me, there was a correspondence to how people made buildings and how people are still making buildings today.
The piece was in Columbus on that site for almost 2 years. That was the first iteration of Exhibit Columbus. We're about to start the third iteration of it. So this was 2017. I really wanted to. I'm not interested in really kind of making replications of form, meaning like I never wanted it to really look like a wigwam. What I really wanted to do was to begin to think about what were the things that informed that particular form, right? The trees, the idea of the bending. And so instead of bending over, I decided to think, well, what if I started to bend things in and up? I couldn't have a fire in this, even though I wanted to, but I couldn't have a fire in this. So what do I make this kind of smoke hole be? In this case, it was about letting the sun in, because during the fall equinox, the piece would be there. And so I oriented it towards that, so that on that particular day, there's the maximum amount of light that gets into the thing. And the thing that kind of led me to this idea of the rebar as part of the structure was this image. The image on the left is from Nabokov and Easton's book about Native American architecture, and they're showing how wigwams are joined together, and that people are still hand tying rebar together, right, by hand. And this notion that this was how those things are kind of connected together. The thing for me was like an animal. It was like it existed on the site. It slept at night. There isn't any kind of lighting on it. I didn't specifically give it a purpose or a program, but the idea or notion that it was there as a place of gathering. The library across the street, the IMP library, they used it for storytelling and things like that. There was a dance company that choreographed a piece around it. So it had this really great life there in Columbus, and so I'm really happy to have done that. But that was the first time I did this installation. This idea that this was one of the times too where I translated what I was doing in the models into full scale. This was the first time I began to do that and started to think about how I was doing that. So the second sort of theme in the work is this idea that drawing is medicine. And so in indigenous culture, we talk about medicine as a thing that not only like makes you feel better, but it addresses all of who you are, right? And so for me, drawing is really an important thing. It's part of my beginning process. And I started to really change the way that I was drawing. I decided early on that I wasn't going to erase anything. So I don't erase anything in the sketchbook. I just draw over those things. The ideas that become more apparent, that start to come out, are the things that start to get highlighted or watercolored. The mistakes, I just don't draw. I do think that we draw how we think, meaning like if things are early sort of thoughts, then we might draw a little light. As things start to get more and more intense, then we start to darken them in, or work on them a little bit more. And so I like to work in that way. And then when I travel, I sketch as well. I filled many sketchbooks. I use the same exact sketchbook. This isn't all of them. It's just a representation of them. I usually fill up 2, sometimes 3 of these a year. But for me, that process of drawing is really important. And so I began to create another set of speculative projects where I was basing it on my tribe's moon calendar. And I specifically didn't want to make architecture that was like a metaphor for the moon. And our moon calendar works in a way where every new moon has a theme. And sometimes that theme is about things we're doing in the environment or things that are happening in the environment. So for instance, the third moon is about maple syruping, gathering the sap and pulling that together. The fourth moon is about thunder. So it's like the first clap of thunder when we hear those things. So some things about planting, harvesting, planting strawberries, planting green corn, hunting, food gathering. Those kinds of things are all rituals that happen in our culture. And so the moons guide those. But I was interested in like, what if I made, what if I started to think about this architecture again that wasn't made by people and wasn't completely inhabited by them. And I gave them all the same parameters, meaning they're all displaced from the ground the same amount, they take up the same sort of volume, they all have some sort of way of addressing the sky, and then they all have these kind of antennae. Do they communicate with one another? And so I'm interested in asking a series of questions instead of like excavating answers and then representing the answers, right? So I find that as a designer, if I begin to ask the right questions and start to sort of ponder these questions through drawing, that this is kind of the intent of each of these. So I designed each of them in this sort of 4 elevation format. But I was also making these digital models, and so I decided I was going to start to render them differently. What would happen if I started to render the sky differently and not just hitting render and save and letting the rendering software do all of the work? And I started to think too about things like, how is it displaced from the ground? What if it was just a bundle of sticks? Could I densely pack a bundle of sticks in order to begin to do that? Or what if the thing had an apparatus at the top to hear the thunder, like a deer's ear? And so when I think of something, I put it in the drawing. I'm not trying to parse out too much when I'm designing or drawing these particular things, right? And so the idea or notion that I begin to do that is really what's important. And so again, I started to change the way that I rendered these things and using the rendering as a tool for me to begin to understand them myself. And so the last and third and final theme that emerges in the work that I've begun to really focus on and sort of cultivate is this idea of decolonizing. And what does that really mean? And what is the role of architecture and design in that? So I think we have to understand what colonization actually is. And so I borrow these terms from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she's talking about researching and dealing with indigenous communities and thinking about that. So she has 3 points that she talks about colonization, right? The first thing is the line. This idea of a map or survey of a territory is a sort of first move in colonization. The second is to create the center, right? The orientation to the system of power might be the church or some other seat of government that gets put into the thing. Creating the capital is the sort of idea here, right? There's a center within that. And then the outside territory or people are in oppositional relation to the center. We're inside, you're outside, you're part of it, you're not. And so the ways that the US was colonized are all of these things, right? This idea that when the settlers came to colonize the land, they did these things, right? They surveyed the land, created a center, made it a state, created a government, and then everyone else was kind of outside and began to push indigenous people further and further west. This map is all of the federally recognized reservations within the US, and you can kind of see the concentration of them through this triangulation pattern, that a lot of them are in the west or pushed to the middle of the US, and you could kind of see that there are very few. The highlighted ones are the top 50 by population. And so this idea or notion that people were put into this terra nullius, or no man's land, in places, landscapes that were harsh, hard to farm, cultivate, hard for people to kind of survive within, and that is part of this idea of the colonization. The other thing I want to kind of point out about the vocabulary of colonization is that we could think of all of these things as architectural acts, right? The idea that you begin to even the terms align, the center, the outside, we use these terms all the time. But could we begin to think about this differently? And for me, the ways that we should be thinking about this is colonization is an apparatus. It's a system that is, it relies on these things. It also relies on a lack of empathy, right? It relies on this idea that in order to keep this third thing, the outside-inside relationship, you have to have a lack of empathy. And I think that that's where we're going wrong. Also in this apparatus, I think for us to dismantle the apparatus, and especially for indigenous people, I think we have to be within it, meaning we have to dismantle the apparatus from the inside. We can't do it from the outside. We have to be like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars and go into the Death Star to dismantle the thing. In order to create it, make it vulnerable, we have to do that from the inside. So that's where I position myself, is as an academic, as someone inside the system. I'm trying to kind of pull that apart and decolonize it in that way. I wrote this research grant and I wanted to look at the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of '69 to June of '71. And so this idea or notion that what they wanted to do when they occupied the island was, after it was decommissioned as a prison, they occupied it based on a treaty that the Lakota people made with the US. And in that treaty, the US government agreed that any land that we deem a surplus, you can have it. And so they deemed Alcatraz Island as surplus US government land, and that's why they wanted to take it. And when they took it, they didn't want to take it for political or financial gain. What they wanted to do was to make it into a native cultural center, an indigenous university. And so when I wrote this research proposal, I wrote not about just researching the occupation itself, but the idea that what they wanted to do was that they wanted to make architecture. And so they wanted to make this native university. And so I am in the process of kind of designing this thing as an ongoing project. But this idea or notion that they wanted to create this university and I was going to design it, and that's part of the project. But I began to look at the things that were really important in this occupation. Graffiti is really important. If you think about this, the rhetoric that's used in resistance movements and these ideas about decolonizing or dismantling systems, rhetoric is really important. In this case, they use graffiti a lot. This is graffiti from the island. So we think about things like Black Lives Matter and other sorts of things that have to have these rhetorical terms that are really sort of powerful. For me, the place that I started was drawing these things, and this one is called trajectories. I'm using all of the trajectories and I try to use every sort of broad definition of that within the drawing, including indigenous issues, where I'm overlaying the Trail of Tears, where people were marched from these parts of the US, the Carolinas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi to Oklahoma, and even where the path that my people took, the Oneida, from New York State to Wisconsin. We purchased that land in Wisconsin. So these are drawn on multi-layers of Mylar. I draw on the front and the back. I use different colored pencils. I'm indexing different kinds of maps and other sorts of things within it. This one is called territory. So I'm using geological maps, plant maps, vegetational maps, aeronautical maps, all these kinds of maps and how the territories are claimed. I'm looking at the idea of land secession, the Lakota Nation in South Dakota, what their land base was shrunken to, my people, the Oneida, and how much of the state that they purchased in 1820, and then how it was shrunk down to the 1830s. The idea, and this is where the notion of how we have to think about changing the canon. the idea that the first American cities were these Acoma pueblos, right? The idea that indigenous people were making cities, they were also making multi-storied buildings in the US, but long before Europeans had even come here, right? We never talk about that in our architectural history. Or the fact that the Anasazi, who was a culture that sort of disappeared, but they were making masonry that rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's no way that they could have had communication with one another. We don't talk about that in our architectural technology courses, right? We don't, when we talk about masonry, we don't ever talk about that, and we really should be talking about that. Those are the areas and things that kind of need to be revised. And so in this drawing, I'm also talking about or using petroglyphs, the idea that territories were claimed through the use of those. I'm also interested in how do we inform data into the work, and how do I use an indigenous mindset to think about that. And so I use these data forms. They're basically just like vertical equals a value, and the density is population by area or people per acre in those top 50 populations. So the project is in this sort of phase where I'm doing massing studies, 3D print massing studies. I'm thinking about using the southern end of the Alcatraz Island to make this university. The drawings themselves kind of go along with it. So for me, this idea or process of the design is ceremony and drawing is medicine, it's all kind of part of this process. I'm really interested in like, how can I make an architecture that it really is like an animal? And I don't just mean like in coloration, pattern, whatever, like how would it begin to inhabit this particular site in that way? So thank you for your time. Let's make architecture indigenous again, and I'd be happy to take your questions and get embed into a discussion about the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Super inspiring work. I was wondering if we can get a bunch of hats with this slogan for the school. Wow, lots to think about. I just wanted to open up for questions. We've got Betsy here and Mark, and then some students, and so I'll let you all take it away.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm reporting in from parts unknown right now, so my internet's a little sketchy. Hey, Chris, how are you? It's Mark Manak.
Yeah.
We put together a really great group of students here to kick off the Q&A. So Sharith, if you're online here, why don't you start us?
All right. Hi, my name is Sharith. I will start us off with some questions. Thank you also for coming to speak to us. I really appreciated it. So my first question would be, what would you say to students of architecture who may not see the significance in understanding culture and histories of minority groups?
Well, this goes back to that idea of the lack of empathy, right? If you know, in architecture, we can't control the people that use the buildings, right? If we just narrow it to buildings, but we should be thinking about every living thing, not just people. Like, how do we make habitats? How do we be okay with that happening? There's a lot of what we do to prevent that from happening, right? Like birds landing on the thing or flying in the windows or whatever. And so the idea or notion that we should really be thinking about the fact that the people that are using the architecture are very different. And then the context that we work within are very different as well, right? I think that the idea or notion that architecture is only for a certain group of people, or the people that can get the funding for it or can afford the designers, is a kind of missed opportunity, is a kind of misrepresentation of things. So, but for me, when it comes to architecture school, I think it's the idea or notion that it's this notion of empathy, of putting yourself into someone else's shoes, that someone else has a different lived experience than you do. And so let's listen to that, right? I don't think that it's just for non-minorities and minorities, right? It's a cross dialogue that we have to be able to kind of put ourselves into. Certainly when we enter into the academy as students, professors, we're putting ourselves in a kind of privileged position. And I do think we have to be cognizant of that as well. But that privilege isn't a universal privilege, meaning like the resources aren't distributed the same. and the opportunities aren't distributed the same either. How can we kind of equalize that? Those are the things that I'm interested in. I have been for a few years now trying less and less and being more and more critical of the term diversity. I don't think we should use it anymore, to be honest, because it's a thing. I say, I'm for diversity. Well, then what are you? It doesn't require any action or agency, right? We should be talking about inclusion, and we should be talking about equity. I think diversity is such a nebulous term that it's easy to kind of act like you're for it, but what are you really doing about it? For me, that's kind of where I position myself, is to think about it in that way. But again, this empathy is really the important thing for us to be able to listen to other voices, right?
Thanks, Chris. Dante, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Lay it
Okay.
on us.
Thank you, Chris, for your lecture and the work that you've done to merge indigenous culture with history and architecture to give it more of a permanent exposure and a physical exposure. Before this lecture, I was watching other lectures that you've given, and based on an interview, you mentioned that if designs could speak, they would tell stories. So my question is, when it comes to non-Indigenous American clients and the general public, how do you see your work expressing and representing Indigenous culture through non-stereotypical designs like zoomorph or pictograph buildings? Do you rely on the general public to do their research, or the occupants and the users of the buildings to tell the story?
I think there's a little bit of both. I think, as a designer, what I'm trying to do is set the stage for the conversation. And in that way, I should say too, that it's important to me because of Indigenous storytelling was not in like an instructional sort of way, but it was, meaning it wouldn't tell you don't play with fire, but it would tell you a story about someone that did play with fire and the consequences of that. And it was up to the individual to figure that out. I think architecture can do that too, right? Like for me, I'm not trying to make these forms and replicate forms of Indigenous dwellings, let's say, but what I am trying to do is, okay, now there's this piece in the world. Let's have a discussion about that. Let's have a discussion about why the Miami don't have such a presence in Indiana anymore. Like those are the kinds of conversations that came out of that piece. That's what I'm interested in. And I don't think that architecture can solve any of these problems in and of itself. We do need to be engaged in it. And I think that includes in the design process as well. I will also say that I don't think that Indigenous thinking is just for Indigenous people. We should not. That's a colonizing sort of mentality, is to say, well, that's only for those people. I think that Indigenous thinking is for everyone, right? And you shouldn't feel like if I'm not Indigenous, that's not for me. No, it is. And I think the things like what we call sustainability or environmental responsibilities are things that were embedded in our culture. And so how can we begin to listen to those people that were Indigenous to those lands? How can we look at Indigenous forest practices to stop wildfires? No one has ever asked Indigenous people, how do we solve this problem? You were here for tens of thousands of years. This must have happened before. How do you deal with it? No one's bothered to ask that question, right? And it's that colonization, the lack of empathy, that just like you don't even think about it. And so if we start thinking about it, and for me, if we started thinking about it in architectural education, then that's where we could begin to do that, right? So that for me is like, if we stop separating what is Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Now, of course, I also think that you don't have to be Indigenous to be colonized either. It is just the effects of colonization are more acute to Indigenous people and to people of color, people that were removed from their lands and put into other places. That, of course, has other ramifications. But I think that we're all being kind of colonized, and if we take and accept everything that we're given especially in educational systems, right?
Sam, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Chris, for being here today. It means a lot to me. So there's an ideology kind of gaining traction within Indigenous liberation movements today called Land Back.
Yeah.
That calls for Indigenous people to have control over nurturing the land and giving it kind of its appropriate uses again. So my question to you is, how can Indigenous and non-Indigenous architects, maybe especially landscape architects, start to manipulate their projects to accommodate land back?
Mm-hmm.
And how can architects start to get involved in such an idea?
Well, I think we first should understand what land back really means. And to me, it's a spectrum of things. It's like literally, okay, this was your land, you can have it back, like all the rights to it, that sort of realm. The other end is to say, well, while you don't own this land, help us understand it. Help, going back to this idea of the forest practices, that's one sort of way. How would you be stewards of this land if we allowed you to be stewards of it? What policies, procedures are in the way of helping Indigenous people be stewards of the land, right? So for me, one of the ways that this land back could start is that if we started looking at land grant colleges in the US in particular, it's alarming and shocking because they stole Indigenous land that had mining on it, other resources. We're talking billions and billions of dollars that are made from land that was stolen, given to universities, and Indigenous people are not in that equation at all. That's where I think it needs to start, to be honest. Like, that's where we should start. But I do think that if we started to think about how Indigenous people inhabited the landscapes that we're working in, and really kind of understanding what it is. And that, to be honest, is also, it's a challenging dialogue because some Indigenous people don't want to communicate that. That's just part of the culture. They feel like that's very protective over that culture. But if we're going to be working in communities, especially in Indigenous communities, we have to have that kind of dialogue. And I think that that's like Indigenous, non-Indigenous, any person, any designer that's working in those areas. How can we begin to think about what lessons can we learn from how people who had been stewards of this land for thousands and thousands of years, how would they deal with it today? And so that's, to me, where the lessons are. It gets very complicated because some of those conflicts are very, they're political. There's a lot of anger. Some of those things are really sort of fraught with conflict, and so it's challenging. But how can we begin? We won't get anywhere if we don't talk about it, right? Like, we have to really kind of talk about it and understand it. I think that these issues, however, are probably more evident in Canada than they are in the US. A lot of Canadian First Nations have these issues where their lands are being taken from them because of mining and oil and other sorts of money-making sort of operations. How could we deal with those resources in a responsible way? Not to say there would never be any mining. Where should we mine? Where shouldn't we mine? How much should we be mining? Who gets the share in the revenue of that? Like, let's have those discussions.
Sharif, Dante, Sam, did you guys have any follow-up for Chris before I ask a couple of questions and then we look to the chat?
I had another question I wrote. So with what's going on with the current world and the pandemic, I'm not sure if you ever thought about how do you see your work adapting to a post-COVID era? Do you think maybe your clients are going to address maybe more concerns of air quality in your projects, or maybe you've thought of how you could retrofit past projects to adapt to the current pandemic?
It's an interesting question. Certainly we should be thinking more about, like, what is a real comfort level of a building. This idea or notion of comfort is like this white European model, right? 72 degrees and whatever the humidity is. Well, that's not comfortable for everyone. That's not comfortable for every climate. Let's think about that. Let's really think about what fresh air means to people. And that we don't always have to live our lives in these sort of hermetic circumstances in buildings, right? That's one way. But I think more and more, I'm really, maybe it's because of where we are, I'm starting to engage in projects now that are being initiated during this phase, right? They're being initiated during COVID. And so I don't know where they're going to go. But I am seeing and thinking about more about how projects are delivered, who's building these things, and how would they build them. Just thinking about, I think, responsibly about contractors and people that are, the guy that's screwing them the light bulbs every day or whatever it is. How can we think responsibly about those situations as well? And not just like, okay, I'm done with the building, I'm gonna photograph it, put it in my portfolio and move on to the next thing. But how do I responsibly, as a designer, think about how projects are going to be administered, inhabited, built? What kind of paint am I using? Those kinds of things. Like those are really kind of things that we should be thinking about. Maybe we would think about more now, like air quality issues for certain, than we had before.
Chris, I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
For somebody that, I like this idea that everyone should work indigenously. Is there, for people that aren't from indigenous backgrounds, to me, there's a fine line between like colonization and appropriation whenever we start to work in these modes. So for those of us that are interested, we should all be interested in it, but for those of us that want to take this on seriously, how do we begin to navigate that? For those of us that want to work for different audiences, diverse audiences, inclusive spaces and things like that, how do we begin to operate in a way that doesn't seem inauthentic?
Yeah.
That's a hard question. I'm sorry.
No, it certainly is. Well, certainly a difficult question. It's something that I may not give you a hard and fast answer to because I don't have it, because it is tricky. But let's try to figure out where the tricks are, where the pitfalls are. So
Right.
For me, one is don't go after indigenous work if you're not indigenous. There are plenty of indigenous architects, and we're all trying to find work, right?
Right.
We're trying to find work too. So that's number one. Number two is I've seen other institutions that are doing work in indigenous communities that there's no one indigenous. There's no indigenous instructor. There's no indigenous students. That's okay, I think, because I think in architecture school, that's a place where we would build this empathy and awareness. Now, sometimes I get brought into those situations as a kind of expert or a reviewer. That's what we should be doing, and trying to help. I do think that if we also thought of it as almost like an academic endeavor, meaning like we have to give credit where credit is due. We have to say, this did come from this culture. This is what I was looking at. I may or may not understand everything. I may get some of these things wrong. And if I offend someone, then I have to deal with that, but I have to take that risk, right?
Yeah.
That appropriation is really important. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Like, one, I have a problem with Bjarke Ingels taking money from the Washington Redskins to design their stadium. I think that he loses all social responsibility, credibility when it comes to from now on, right? Like he should have known better, is my point.
Right.
That's an example of like that. You can't do that. The Canadians also have, in general, and their policies are more, I think, indigenous friendly than they are in the U.S. But they have a thing called nothing about us without us, meaning like you wouldn't do a federal housing project with no indigenous representation, whether they're designers, community members, whatever. That I think is an important sort of place to start. And also you have to understand, and this is where it's tricky, is you have to understand where stereotype is in the spectrum of what you're doing, right? Am I stereotyping too much? And if so, how can I dig further into this? Now, the challenge, for sure, I mean, the challenge is the resources are not extensive, meaning like there aren't a lot of books about it. There aren't a lot of native architecture books. There's like 2 really good ones, I think, and a few really not so good ones. And this, so I guess what I'm trying to do too is to help people do that, is to say, well, I'm not trying to replicate the form. Let's look at what resulted in the form. What cultural things happened? How are people seeing the landscape, the materials, the use to get that? Does that help?
No, yeah, I think that's it's a fine line, and I think that we can go to we can all go in with good intentions, I think, into this work, but sometimes we don't necessarily, we need to keep all of those aspects in mind. The other thing I was really struck by is the relationship to your attitude about disrupting the system from within, and also the way that you're not dismissive of the canon as is. Like you want to expand it. And do you think that those two things are related? Like the way that you, even in your drawings, the way you appropriate even some of the stencils of Corb and that sorts of things, like that you're, maybe I shouldn't have used the word appropriate, just smack me around if I'm wrong. But like the way that you talked about the revolution from within the system, to me, there's somehow correlates to your intellectual project in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think
is that conscious?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's a keen observation, because I see my architectural education as an emancipation. It's not something that has restricted me, meaning it got me off the reservation. I always wanted to be an architect, well, from a time when I was very young, but I didn't know how to do that until people helped me figure it out. And that was challenging. That's a whole other lecture. But I think what you're seeing as appropriation isn't really appropriation, because it's part of my discipline, right?
Right.
So I think of it as more of a, like, okay, I'm going to take conventions and use them and almost pervert them, because the dialogue that I want to have is a dialogue with a syntax that already exists, but I want a new syntax, right? I love drafting, and so I love templates. I love line weights. I love line types. I'm going to use them, right? And I'm going to turn them on their head. And so even drawing the things in elevation, there's a convention, and that for me, that's the gateway in, right? So I like Star Wars as a metaphor for life, but Luke Skywalker and Han Solo had to get into stormtrooper suits to get into the Death Star. That's me. When I'm using line types, I'm using architectural models like that. I'm getting in that way, and I'm already in. And so for me to dismantle it, I'm going to say, oh, well, I love Corb. I do love Corb. I love the golden section. But that's not it. That's not the end. That's not the answer, right? Let's use it. I will also say that I don't think all Indigenous architects would agree with me 100%.
Right.
In that regard. And that's fine too. I mean, we're okay to have disagreements in that regard. But it is important to me to be within the system, because I feel like if we're just always outside, like throwing sticks at it, that nothing's really going to change if we're not in it. So we need, and it's not just our discipline, we need more people of color and lawyers, doctors, politicians, for sure, right?
Right.
I'm surprised that there aren't, I can't think off the top of my head of an Indigenous governor at the moment. We have a few Indigenous congresswomen now. But the time, we're whatever, 500-600 years into this, why isn't an Indigenous person run for president yet?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But even look at our discipline, though. Our discipline, so few, like I think there may be 15, 20 Indigenous licensed architects in the US. I'm not licensed, but
wow.
Yeah.
Well, I figure we could talk all day here, Chris, but we're going to segue to the chat here. There were a couple questions that came up. One was the students asking for advice on good sketchbook practice? Like how do we make our sketchbooks look as good as Chris Cornelius sketchbooks?
I'll tell you exactly what I do is, one, I don't think of it as a precious thing. Here's a couple thoughts. One is like the challenges I tried to get over. One was I open my sketchbook and I'm looking at this blank thing. Where do I start? The idea is just to start. Just start drawing. Draw anything, draw any shape, any form, get your pencil, pen, whatever, moving on the page. Something will come out. I think you'll be more successful in getting something out than sitting there and thinking about something. So oftentimes, even some of the pages that I've shown were pages like that. Or it might just be like, oh, I was wondering, well, what if I use it watercolor? What if I use this marker, this pen, this sticker, this paint, this whatever? Just pulling out techniques, all of those things will come out. And again, like I decided I wasn't going to erase anything. I found that by erasing things, maybe I got that erasing what should or shouldn't be erased got in the way. Just keep drawing and something will kind of come out. The other thing is kind of a rigor, right? The idea that I'm going to draw every day. I don't draw every day, but I wish I did. But the idea or notion that, okay, and now I'm going to sit down and give myself an hour just to draw. I don't care what it is. I'm just going to draw. And what you draw doesn't have to be for everyone, meaning you don't have to show it to anyone ever if you don't want to. You can choose to do that or not, but you really should just be drawing. For me, it's thinking, like the way that I think, the way that I feel better about things, I can start to get things out. I also draw when I read, meaning like when I'm reading something, I might start drawing like a diagram of what is being said, and that kind of help me understand things. So that's, that, and I've tried different sketchbooks, even formats, to be honest. Sometimes they were big, sometimes they were like too big, and so I started drawing in these really small sketchbooks, and then now I've used the sort of moleskin as a format. I haven't changed that. Maybe I need to change it for myself, but if you find a format that you like, then go with it.
Greer, are we running out of time here?
I think we've got a couple more minutes.
All
Yeah,
right.
Mark, I wonder if we could combine the last two questions. Nathan Smith and Nick Sturm asked about the concept of sustainability, expanding it past building systems towards kind of landscapes. And I apologize to Nathan and Nick if I'm summarizing too quickly, but Nick mentions the Stars Above, Earth Below book that discusses some of the views toward nature that are gaining traction in light of environmental crisis and relation to indigenous peoples' perspectives toward nature, and thinking about kind of building science, technology versus natural systems. What are some of your thoughts about those related issues?
I think that they are related. And if we thought about the idea of relationships again, this idea of what comfort is, what sustainability is, what does that really mean? Why would we want to change the quality of light in a room or air in a room? How versatile would we make that? What are the mechanical systems to accomplish that as a full sort of spectrum thing, not just to meet a checklist, let's say, or some sort of commissioning standard to get a LEED platinum, whatever. I also think, and this hasn't really, I haven't found much traction, but I do think that indigenous nations should have their own sustainability standards that are based on the culture and not on checklists, right? Like what things in nature can we find as lessons for that? So I do think that even if we taught architectural technology differently, and we wouldn't have to say, we would explicitly like, okay, this is the indigenous architectural technology course. Like I wouldn't say that. For instance, I give a lecture to like second-year undergrads about materials, and I say at the beginning of the lecture, well, you're only in the second year of your education. You may not really know that much about materials. Like you might know what concrete, stone, brick are, steel, whatever, and then you kind of make all the buildings out of whatever you know. But let's talk about characteristics and qualities. Let's talk about what's heavy, what's light, what's soft, what's hard. And then in the lecture, I give all animal analogies. When I talk about mass, I show the bear and the amount of weight that a bear puts down. Or when I'm talking about transparency, I might show a jellyfish, and we start to think about those things as translucent. I think that we could give those kinds of lessons about things that happen in nature, and then we begin to build that empathy with nature. Like our buildings are trying to be sympathetic with those things. I don't know this book, Stars Above, Earth Below. I do know another book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which was written by a botanist. It's amazing. And I think like every architecture student should read it. And I will also say too, if you've read the book, I would get the audio book because she speaks the language in the audio thing. And I think there's something really important about hearing her speak the language instead of just reading it. But she talks about a lot of things. Some of the things that I kind of talk about too, or she's talking about how maple trees give sap, and she as a scientist understands all of that, but she gives you all of the lessons from her Ojibwe culture, which are similar to my culture. And I think that we could begin to think about, if we thought about mechanical systems that way, resources, why is cross-laminated timber so cool, right? Like, I think we could think about that as an indigenous sort of perspective. And it is cool, I like it. But not just like in a kind of fad thing, right? Like Blaine wrote this amazing book about materials. And so I think that we could even talk about the book in this kind of way, right? We could begin to think about it. Which right there means for me, like I wouldn't reject the book and say, oh, this is a colonized way of understanding materials. No, it's a wonderful book, but how will we change the way that we would talk about that in our building technology course? I think the same is true for like digital technologies. I don't know exactly what that is, meaning like what if I was going to teach a Rhino or a Grasshopper course, how would I begin to think about that a little bit differently? But for me specifically, maybe this is where I'll end on this sort of notion. As an instructor, I haven't really taught an Indigenous studio or an Indigenous course. However, I think that any student I've ever had knows that when I speak about things, I speak about them from an Indigenous perspective. So I teach studios, like I have a hip hop studio. I talk about hip hop as a culture, and I use the same methodologies from my Indigenous work in examining that culture. But so I feel like, and I've been thinking about this the past few years, is that I'm building an Indigenous Trojan horse, meaning I'm teaching students Indigenous ways of thinking without them really knowing that. Meaning like I'm not explicit about that, saying this is how an Indigenous person would think about it. No, this is how we should be thinking about it. Then I feel like that has more resonance with the students in that regard, to say that, because if you start to compartmentalize first, then they'll always kind of think of it in that way, which is true of sustainability, I think.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and expanding our knowledge, which is one of the highest things we can hope for these lectures, and you've certainly done it. So thank you.
Good.
Thank you for sharing your beautiful work and so many things to think about. And I want to thank the students and faculty in the panel. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I think we've all got some inspiration to work with this afternoon and beyond. So thank you all for joining us, and everyone have a great weekend.